you've got this incredible story of coming up, becoming a Navy SEAL, being, I think, the first one of your high school in over a decade to go into, you've accomplished so much, but you've also struggled with your health, with mental health as well. Can you kind of set up the story of how you transition outside of like Navy SEAL life, or even if it was maybe at that time where you were a Navy SEAL, you were struggling and had to deal with these health issues?
So for me, it started, I spent 14 years on active duty. And as I was getting off of active duty in 2011, I had a lot of kind of survivor's guilt, I guess. And that sort of, just that kind of feeling of, I had friends that had been killed in combat and in training and other places, and feeling like, that it didn't really make sense why I was still around and had all my body parts and like was fine, presumably. And that had happened to these other guys who I kind of thought were better than me in a lot of ways, and that just kind of led to this feeling of, I think a lot of times mental health problems, so to speak, they sort of snowball. So what can start small kind of builds on itself and becomes worse the next day, and a little worse and a little worse. It's a lot like chronic physical illness as well. Yeah. And so for me, that kind of evolved into this feeling like, well, something must be wrong with me, right? Like I must have some kind of condition a disease or something like that, that's going to take me out. And so I started kind of looking for it, I think unconsciously in some ways, but I would zero in on various sensations that I would have in my body, tingling, whatever. It's stuff that I think most people feel, but just don't think anything of it. And rightfully so. They just kind of gaff it off as like, whatever, I would kind of say, well, that's the beginning of some dreaded, yet to be determined fatal condition. And as you know, and I didn't know at the time, if you do that, it will make it worse, because what you're doing is you are ramping up your limbic system and basically telling your body that it's in danger. And those danger signals will then make those sensations worse, because you think they're symptoms of something, and then everything gets worse, right? Like your fear gets worse, and then the symptoms get worse. I should say sensations. They're not symptoms really of anything. And that's what happened to me. And I just became a sort of a basket case. I would like just be dizzy all the time and super tired and didn't know what was wrong with me, and just kept looking for a physical problem, like having the doctors run tests on me and blood work and everything. And they're like, look, you're fine. Like there's nothing wrong with you. And I was like, it's got to be something. And that kind of went on for a while, even post, like I got out of the military, and I was kind of a waste. Like I couldn't function very well. It leads to a lot of brain fog, and you become kind of a recluse. But I guess I had enough wherewithal to figure out that eventually I came across this guy, Charles Linden, who has this thing called the Linden method. And it's about anxiety, and it's about this exact scenario. And I read his story, and I was just struck by like, wow, I had no idea that you could just sort of do this to your body through your mind, basically, like how bad you could make yourself feel physically just through what you were thinking, essentially. And that was a real revelation for me. So I kind of did his method, and I eventually kind of got my way out of it. Like, it wasn't perfect, but I realized, okay, I finally came to terms with there's probably nothing actually physically wrong with you that's causing these things at the time. But then fast forward 5 years to 2016, and I had this mold exposure at my house. I was pressure washing my driveway and then pressure washing the inside of this shed that we had attached to our house. And not really thinking anything of it. I wasn't using chemicals. It was I just had water. It's had, a garden hose attached to this pressure washer I got from Home Depot, spraying all this crap off for hours. And I didn't think anything of it. I'm just cleaning stuff, right? And it's just the next day I felt so weird. It was like, I mean, it's very hard to describe to people that have never had chronic illness what it's like to feel that way. And I tell like my wife, I wish sometimes that I could give somebody who's got their health, I like give them a day of like what it feels like to have an ongoing chronic illness and be like, you try to function feeling this way. And so, but I didn't know what was going on. It was like, what I just couldn't focus on it. I just felt so strange. It was like someone had just poured cement into my head. But I was like, I didn't think anything really severe at the time. I just kind of went home and took a nap, but then it just never went away. And I would have all these other weird symptoms. I would have these lightning bolt sensations going through my head and tremors. And I mean, like times where I was just on the couch all weekend. And so I went to the doctor. Well, first I should say, I was like, well, maybe this is all that sort of anxiety stuff rearing its ugly head, right? But I realized that like I wasn't really worrying about that stuff anymore. And I tried some of those methods and it didn't kind of work. And it was just a little bit different. So I did what everybody in chronic illness does. I went to the regular doctor and they had no clue what was wrong with me. And they ran sort of standard blood work and they're like, well, nothing's wrong. And then I went down the path that everybody else goes down, which is you try all this alternative stuff and you get really out there because like you either give up or you try something. And I always tell people that when I think some people disparage alternative treatments, whatever you want to call it, and denigrate that. And I go, and I sort of feel like, well, what do you want me to do? Because conventional medicine just threw up their hands and said, sorry, we got nothing for you. So what do you want me to do? Right? Like they gave up. This isn't House MD where it's, I will find the solution to this problem, right? Anyway, that's a kind of a long-winded answer there. But I will say, I think 5 years after the fact, 7 years after the fact at this point, I think what I realized too is that it wasn't just I had this mental problem and then this physical problem. They really were combined. Like there was certainly stuff that was priming me for this collapse way before that mold exposure, right? That was a trigger, but it's not the sole source. I mean, as you know, that's another big sort of misconception in the, I think in just medicine in general, is you hear it all the time. It's like, we're trying to find the cause. You hear that all the time. Like, we don't know what the cause of cancer is. It's like, well, that's because there isn't a cause, guys. Like your thinking is wrong on this. It's multiple causes. And so you can't think of it that way. And I have people say that to me all the time. Did they ever figure out what was wrong with you? I'm like, well, you're not really asking the right question. Mm-hmm. It's like, there's tons of things wrong with me that all are adding up to this problem that need to be sort of peeled back and addressed, one at a time.
We get really fixated on the cause and the cure, as if it's like totally a one-on-one thing. It's like, oh, it was that one thing and you did this one thing to cure yourself? Yeah. Never. We don't do that. And it's interesting, Chris, because we don't do that in life, right? It's like, what's the one thing that made you successful? No one could do that because they're like, well, there was 1,000 little things from, when I was born to this, to every little thing that led up to where I am right now. And there is not one thing in success in life. And it's definitely not like that in health. Now, excuse me, mold is really tricky. I'm actually speaking as someone right now that went through Lyme treatment with us, did very well, and recently moved down to Florida, was exposed to mold and saying these symptoms are like nothing I've ever had before. I was in the depths of chronic Lyme and it wasn't like this. My mind wasn't playing tricks on me this bad, even with neurological Lyme disease for a number of years.